The wedding planner's group text was still open on my phone. Venue deposit confirmed. Thank you all. When my mother called to inform me, in the same cheerful voice she'd used to announce a sale at the grocery store, that she and my father had decided to gift my younger sister Adeline the down payment for her dream wedding venue, using money withdrawn from the joint investment account my grandmother had left specifically in her own handwritten will, to be divided equally among my grandchildren, no exceptions. I had received my third of that inheritance 11 months earlier, the day the estate finally cleared. Adeline, according to my mother, had already spent hers on the honeymoon and needed a little help catching up. And my parents had simply decided, quietly, without consulting me, to withdraw the difference from what remained of my grandmother's account. An account I did not know still had any remaining balance at all, because I had never once been told by anyone that my own third had been left sitting untouched in a joint holding account for safekeeping, rather than distributed to me directly like Adeline's had been. I asked my mother one simple question about whose name was actually on that account. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I checked my phone to see if the call had dropped. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet people find their voice. If stories about standing your ground speak to you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe so you never miss one. My name is Beatrix Sorensen Vance. I'm 33 years old, and for 11 months I believed I had already received my full, rightful share of my grandmother's estate. What I actually discovered, over the following 7 weeks, was that my parents had never fully distributed it at all. They'd simply told me they had. I have to take you back 2 years, to the week my grandmother, Ingrid Sorensen, passed away at 89, in the same lakeside cottage she'd lived in for 6 decades, to explain exactly how careful, exactly how specific she had been about what she wanted, and exactly how thoroughly that specificity got quietly unwound after she was gone. My grandmother was a woman who trusted paper more than she trusted people's memory of a conversation, a trait I inherited from her more directly, I've come to understand, than I inherited from either of my own parents. She had been a bookkeeper for a regional lumber company for 31 years before retiring, and she carried that same exacting precision into every corner of her personal life. A handwritten ledger of every gift she'd ever given any of us, a filing cabinet organized by year going back to 1974, a will she'd revised herself, in her own careful cursive, every time a grandchild was born or a family circumstance changed enough to warrant it. There are 3 of us grandchildren on my mother's side. Me, my younger sister Adeline, 29, and our cousin Desmond, 31, the son of my mother's brother Havard, who lives 2 states away and has always existed at a slight, comfortable distance from the day-to-day texture of our immediate family. My grandmother's final will, executed 4 years before she died, was explicit almost to the point of redundancy about the one asset she cared most about protecting from exactly the kind of quiet reshuffling that eventually happened to it. A joint investment account, built over decades from careful, unglamorous saving, containing at the time of her death just over $261,000, to be divided into 3 exactly equal shares, one for each grandchild, distributed directly, in her own words, underlined twice in the original document. Not through my children, but to my grandchildren themselves, as adults capable of managing their own inheritance. I want to explain why she felt the need to underline that particular instruction, because I think it matters enormously for understanding everything that followed. My grandmother had watched, over the decades, a slow and specific pattern develop in how my parents handled money that passed through their hands on its way to someone else. Not outright theft, nothing so simple or so easily named, but a kind of persistent, low-grade redirection, a habit of treating any family money that touched their own accounts, even briefly, as something they retained a certain ongoing right to manage, redistribute, or hold on to for safekeeping, according to their own private sense of who currently needed it most. My grandmother had seen this pattern play out with a smaller inheritance from her own late husband decades earlier, money intended for specific purposes that had, through a series of individually reasonable-sounding decisions, ended up serving whichever of her children's needs felt most urgent in a given season. She built her final will, I have come to understand, specifically as a kind of structural defense against that exact pattern repeating itself with her grandchildren's money. The estate cleared roughly 14 months after her death, moving through the specific, unglamorous, bureaucratic machinery of probate at the careful pace such things always seem to move. I remember the day my third arrived, $87,000, wired directly into an account in my own name, exactly as my grandmother's will had specified, exactly as I'd expected. I remember calling my mother that same afternoon, genuinely moved, to tell her the money had come through, and I remember her response, warm and unremarkable at the time, that Adeline's share had also cleared around the same time. A detail I had no reason in that moment to examine any further. What I did not know, what I would not learn for another 11 months, was that Adeline's share had not, in fact, been distributed the same way mine had. I want to walk through, carefully, exactly how I eventually discovered this, because the specific mechanics of the discovery matter as much as the discovery itself. The catalyst arrived, as these things so often do in stories like mine, through an entirely ordinary phone call about an entirely different subject. Adeline had gotten engaged 8 months earlier to a genuinely lovely man named Rutger, and the wedding planning had, over those 8 months, become the primary organizing activity of most of our family's conversations, the specific texture of a family temporarily orbiting one member's upcoming celebration. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening, breezy and warm, to share the news that she and my father had decided to help cover the shortfall on Adeline's venue deposit, since Adeline had, according to my mother's account, already spent her own inheritance on a lavish honeymoon booked well in advance of the actual wedding planning, leaving her short on the funds needed to secure the venue she'd fallen in love with. I want to describe exactly what I felt hearing this, because I think the specific texture of my initial reaction matters. My first response was not suspicion. It was simple, warm generosity. Of course I understood a sister needing a little help. Of course I thought it was kind of our parents to step in. It was only when my mother mentioned, almost in passing, exactly where the additional funds were coming from, that something in my chest went suddenly, sharply still. "We just pulled it from what was left in your grandmother's account," she said, in the same tone she might use to describe pulling a sweater from a drawer. There was still a decent amount sitting there, so it made sense to use it rather than dip into our own savings. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage in the moment, what she meant by what was left. My understanding, I told her, had always been that the account had been fully, equally distributed among the three of us 11 months earlier, exactly as Grandma's will specified. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause I've come to recognize, across several stories now, as the particular sound of someone recalculating, in real time, exactly how much of an actual answer a question deserves. "Well," my mother said finally, "your father and I thought it made more sense to hold your and Desmond's shares in the joint account a little longer, since neither of you had an immediate need for the full amount at once, the way Adeline did with the wedding coming up. We figured we'd distribute the rest gradually, as things came up." I want to be honest about the specific, cold clarity that settled over me in that moment, because I think it's important to name it precisely. I had been told, 11 months earlier, explicitly, that my full share had cleared. I had built financial decisions, a modest home renovation, an increased retirement contribution, a debt payoff I'd been quietly proud of around the understanding that I had received the entirety of what my grandmother had left me, what my mother was now describing. In the same breezy tone she'd used to discuss grocery sales, was that only a portion of my inheritance had actually been distributed, that the remainder had been sitting, unmentioned, in a joint account under my parents' ongoing informal control, and that they had just decided, without a single word to me, to draw from that undisclosed remainder to fund my sister's wedding shortfall. I asked my mother directly the question that opens this story, whose name was actually on that account. There was a long, specific silence, and then she said, in a voice considerably smaller than the one she'd started the call with, "It's still in your grandmother's name, technically. We've just been managing the disbursements as the estate's informal executors." I want to explain something about probate and estate administration that I did not fully understand at the time of that call, but that became critically important over the following weeks. An estate is not supposed to remain in an informal, ongoing state of management 14 months after it has formally cleared probate. Once a will is probated and assets are ordered distributed, the executor has a legal obligation to actually complete that distribution within a reasonable timeframe, not to retain funds indefinitely under their own discretionary control, redistributing pieces of it according to whichever grandchild's needs feel most urgent in a given season. What my mother was describing, without apparently understanding the legal weight of what she was describing, was a probate account that had never actually been fully closed out, sitting under my parents' continued informal control considerably longer than any proper administration of my grandmother's estate should have allowed. If you've ever discovered that money you believed was already fully yours had actually been quietly held back, managed by someone else's private sense of who needed it more, you already know exactly the kind of stillness that settled over me on that call. Stay with me, because what I found once I actually requested the estate's formal accounting records is not what I expected either. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this before I tell you what my father said when I finally asked to see the paperwork. I did not confront my parents further on that call. I want to explain why, because I think the reasoning matters. I understood, in that moment, that continuing to push over the phone would simply produce more of the same soft, reassuring vagueness. We'll get you the rest soon. Don't worry about it. Without ever actually forcing a full, documented accounting of exactly how much of my inheritance remained, exactly why it had never been distributed, and exactly what else might have quietly been drawn from it over the preceding 11 months. Instead, I did what I have always done under exactly this kind of pressure. I ended the call calmly, and I began, methodically, gathering information before I let a single emotion drive a single confrontation. I want to walk through what I did next, because I think the specific, patient texture of it matters more than any single dramatic beat. The following morning, I called the probate attorney who had originally handled my grandmother's estate, a careful, unhurried man named Nathaniel Aquiosa, whose contact information I still had from the original distribution process. I explained, plainly, that I had recently learned my full inheritance had not, in fact, been distributed as I'd originally been told, and I asked what my rights were as a named beneficiary to request a formal accounting of the estate's remaining assets and disbursements. Nathaniel's response reframed the entire scope of what I was actually looking at. As a named beneficiary under a probated will, he told me, you have an absolute legal right to request a full, formal accounting of the estate at any point, including all disbursements made after the initial distribution, and including documentation of who authorized those disbursements and under what legal authority. If your parents were formally appointed as co-executors, they have a fiduciary duty to have completed the distribution and closed the estate within a reasonable timeframe following probate. Generally understood, in this state, to be well under a year absent some genuinely extraordinary circumstance. 14 months of continued informal control, with disbursements apparently being made at their own discretion rather than according to the will's explicit equal division instruction, is, frankly, exactly the kind of pattern probate courts take seriously when a beneficiary raises it. I want to be honest about the specific, layered grief I felt hearing that assessment, because I don't want to present this as a purely clarifying, purely empowering moment. Part of what I felt was real anger, real and specific, at the discovery that my own parents had apparently decided, without consulting me, that my grandmother's explicit instruction, not through my children, but to my grandchildren themselves, as adults capable of managing their own inheritance, simply didn't apply to the full amount, that some portion of what she'd carefully, deliberately protected from exactly this kind of quiet redirection had been redirected anyway. Held back under the comfortable, informal fiction of ongoing management. But part of what I felt, underneath the anger, was something closer to grief for my grandmother specifically, the particular grief of understanding that the exact pattern she had spent her final years trying to structurally prevent had, in fact, happened anyway, simply delayed by 14 months and dressed up in more careful language. I requested the formal accounting through Nathaniel's office the following week, a process that took roughly 3 weeks to fully assemble, given that my parents, once formally asked through proper legal channels rather than a casual phone call, needed to produce documentation for exactly how the remaining funds had been managed. I want to describe what that accounting revealed, because I think the specific numbers matter for understanding the full scope of what had actually happened. The account, at the time of the original distribution 11 months earlier, had held $261,000, meant to be divided into 3 equal shares of $87,000 each. My share had indeed been fully distributed as promised. Desmond's share, our cousin, 2 states away, considerably less involved in the day-to-day texture of family financial conversations, had also been distributed in full, I was relieved to learn, at the same time as mine. What had not been distributed was Adeline's full share, which had, according to the accounting, been deliberately, specifically held back at the time of the original distribution, with only $52,000 of her $87,000 actually transferred to her directly. The remaining $35,000 kept in the joint account under my parents' continued informal control. Ostensibly, according to a brief note in my father's handwriting attached to the accounting. To help manage Adeline's spending given her history with impulsive purchases. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because I think it reveals something important and considerably more complicated than the simple favoritism narrative I'd initially assumed I was walking into. My parents had not, in fact, been simply redirecting my share toward my sister out of straightforward preference. What they had done instead was unilaterally decide, on their own private judgment, and without consulting either Adeline or the estate's actual legal terms, that Adeline herself was not capable of responsibly managing her own full inheritance. A judgment my grandmother's will, in its explicit language, had specifically anticipated and specifically, deliberately overridden. Precisely because she understood her own children's tendency to substitute their private judgment for her clearly stated wishes. The $35,000 withheld from Adeline's original distribution had over the following 11 months been drawn down gradually, a portion toward her wedding dress, a portion toward a car repair, and most recently, the venue deposit shortfall my mother had originally called to tell me about, each disbursement made, according to the accounting, at my parents' own discretion, sometimes with Adeline's knowledge and request, sometimes, according to a note I found particularly troubling, simply deposited into her account as a surprise, without her having asked for it at all. I want to describe the specific moment I understood the full shape of what this meant, because I think it matters. This was not primarily a story about my parents favoring Adeline over me, though there was certainly an uncomfortable asymmetry buried within it. It was, more precisely and more troublingly, a story about my parents believing, with real and apparently sincere conviction, that they retained an ongoing right to manage their adult children's inheritance according to their own private judgment about who could be trusted with it. A belief that had, in Adeline's case, resulted in her receiving only 60% of what she was legally, explicitly entitled to, dispensed to her gradually, like an allowance, rather than delivered to her directly as an adult, exactly as my grandmother's will had specifically, deliberately instructed. I called Adeline directly, before I did anything else, because I understood, sitting with this accounting, that she deserved to know the full truth before I took any further action, and because I genuinely did not know, at that point, whether she was aware of the full scope of what had been withheld from her. I want to describe that conversation carefully, because it surprised me. Adeline, it turned out, had known that some portion of her inheritance was being held by our parents. She'd been told, at the time of the original distribution, a story similar to what I'd initially been told, except in her case framed as, "We're going to help you manage this since you're planning a wedding, and it's easy to overspend during something like that." But she had not known, with any real specificity, exactly how much had been withheld, or that the full remaining amount, according to our grandmother's actual will, was legally hers to control outright. "They've been treating it like an allowance," Adeline told me, and I could hear in her voice a specific, quiet hurt that told me this conversation was surfacing something she'd been uneasy about for longer than she'd let herself fully articulate. Every time I want to use some of it, I have to kind of ask, and they decide whether it's a good enough reason. I didn't realize that wasn't actually how Grandma set it up. I want to be clear that Adeline and I did not, in that conversation or in the weeks that followed, become adversaries in any sense. If anything, the discovery brought us considerably closer than we'd been in years, united by a shared, specific frustration at discovering that our parents had, independently of either of our wishes, decided to substitute their own judgment for our grandmother's explicit instructions, treating both of us, in different ways, as less capable of managing our own money than she had clearly, deliberately intended us to be trusted to be. If you've ever discovered that your family's quiet, well-meaning management of your own inheritance was actually a direct override of what the person who left it to you had specifically, explicitly wanted, you already know exactly the kind of resolve that settled into both Adeline and me over the following weeks. Stay with me, because what happened when we brought this to our parents together is not the confrontation either of them expected. Subscribe now so you don't lose this before I tell you what my father said once he finally understood what he'd actually done. Adeline and I decided, together, to approach our parents jointly rather than separately, understanding that a unified, documented presentation of the actual legal terms of our grandmothers would carry considerably more weight than either of us raising individual grievances that could more easily be dismissed as personal resentment, or, in my case specifically, jealousy over Adeline's wedding. We arranged a family meeting, deliberately framed in the invitation as a conversation about finalizing Grandma's estate, language specific enough to signal seriousness without escalating into open conflict before we'd even sat down. I brought the formal accounting Nathaniel had helped assemble. Adeline brought her own bank records, documenting exactly how much had actually been deposited into her account over the preceding 11 months versus the full $87,000 she was legally entitled to. I want to describe that meeting carefully, because I think the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter more than any single dramatic line within it. We sat at the same kitchen table where countless ordinary family dinners had happened over the years, and I laid the accounting out plainly, the same way I imagine any of you watching this have watched me lay out documentation before, not with accusation in my voice, but with the specific, level clarity of someone simply presenting facts that speak for themselves. Grandma's will said the account was to be divided equally among the three of us, distributed directly to us as adults, not managed through you, I said. According to this accounting, Desmond and I received our full shares. Adeline received 60% of hers, with the remainder held back and dispersed gradually, at your discretion, over the following 11 months. That's not what the will said. I need to understand why that happened, and I need the remaining $35,000, plus whatever portion of Adeline's original distribution has already been spent without her full knowledge of what it actually represented, formally, fully accounted for and distributed to her directly, the way Grandma specifically, explicitly instructed. I want to describe my father's reaction, because I think it represents the actual emotional core of this story more than any single legal detail within it. He did not, in that moment, immediately deny anything or become defensive in the way I'd half-braced myself for. What he did, instead, was sit with the accounting for a long moment, reading through it slowly, and then he said something I want to give you as precisely as I can remember it. "We weren't trying to steal from her," he said, looking at Adeline rather than me. "We were trying to protect you. You've always struggled with impulse spending, sweetheart, since you were a teenager, and we thought, if we just handed you $87,000 all at once, right when you were planning a wedding and not thinking clearly about money, you'd burn through it in a year and have nothing left. We thought we were being responsible." I want to sit with that explanation for a moment, because I think it deserves a genuinely honest, complicated response rather than a simple dismissal. There was, I believe, real love and real concern embedded in what my father said, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. What made it, nonetheless, a serious breach, legally and personally, was not the underlying concern itself, but the specific, unilateral decision to override an adult daughter's legal right to her own inheritance based on that concern, without ever once having an honest, direct conversation with her about it, without ever asking her whether she wanted help managing the money, without ever telling her, plainly, exactly how much was actually being withheld and why. "Dad," Adeline said, and I want to give her this moment fully, because I think her response mattered more than anything I could have said. "I'm 29 years old. I run my own small business. I've never once missed a bill payment in my adult life. You didn't ask me if I wanted help managing this money. You just decided on your own that I couldn't be trusted with it, and then you doled it out to me like an allowance for almost a year without ever telling me that's what you were doing. That's not protection. That's you deciding, without my consent, that Grandma's own explicit instructions about her own money didn't apply to me specifically." I want to describe what happened next, because I think it represents something genuinely important about how this particular story resolved, differently in some ways from other stories I've told you, where the resolution required considerably more adversarial legal action. My father did not, in that meeting, continue to defend the arrangement. He sat with what Adeline had said for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly and said, "You're right. I think I convinced myself I was still your parent making decisions for you, the way I did when you were 16, instead of actually seeing you as the adult you've become. That's on me. That's on both of us." My mother, I want to be honest, took considerably longer to arrive at the same acknowledgement, and I don't want to smooth over that difference. She spent much of that initial meeting defending the arrangement more actively than my father, returning several times to the specific framing that they'd only ever wanted to help. A framing that, while perhaps sincerely felt, did not, in my assessment or Adeline's, adequately reckon with the actual legal and personal weight of what had happened. It took, honestly, 2 further conversations over the following weeks, one of which included Nathaniel formally explaining, in plain terms, the fiduciary obligations my parents had actually held as informal estate administrators, before my mother fully, genuinely absorbed the seriousness of what had occurred rather than continuing to frame it as a simple, well-meaning parental choice. We resolved the matter, ultimately, without pursuing formal legal action against my parents, a decision Adeline and I made together, deliberately, understanding that we had every legal right to pursue it further, but choosing, instead, a path that prioritized repairing what could still be repaired within the family rather than pursuing maximum accountability through the courts. My parents formally, fully distributed the remaining $35,000 to Adeline within 2 weeks of that first meeting, along with a complete, itemized accounting of exactly how the previously disbursed $52,000 had actually been used, so that Adeline could, for the first time in 11 months, fully understand and control the entirety of what our grandmother had left her. I want to describe one more conversation, because I think it represents the actual, meaningful emotional resolution of this entire story, more than any dollar amount transferred. Roughly a month after that first family meeting, my mother called me, and I want to give you her words as precisely as I can remember them. "I've been thinking about your grandmother a lot," she said, "about how careful she was with that will, how specific." I think some part of me resented that specificity at the time. Honestly, it felt like she didn't trust us, her own children, to make good decisions about our own kids' inheritance. I understand now that she wasn't distrusting us specifically. She just watched, over her whole life, how easily good intentions turn into quiet control if nobody puts a clear boundary around them. I wish I'd understood that before you had to be the one to show it to me on paper. Here's what I learned, sitting at that kitchen table with an accounting document in front of me, watching my father slowly, uncomfortably reckon with 11 months of decisions he'd made on my sister's behalf without ever once asking her permission. Families can build, across generations, a quiet, persistent belief that love and authority are the same thing, that caring about someone's well-being automatically grants you the right to manage their money, their choices, their inheritance, according to your own private judgment about what's best for them, regardless of what they've actually asked for or what the person who left them that inheritance explicitly, deliberately intended. But a will, written in someone's own careful hand, underlined twice for exactly this reason, does not particularly care how sincerely that quiet control was meant. It only needs one formal accounting, requested plainly and pursued patiently, to finally fully speak for itself. If you've ever discovered that money or property meant explicitly for you had been quietly managed, withheld, or redirected by family members who told themselves they were simply helping, this story was for you. Do one thing for me this week. If you're the beneficiary of any inheritance, trust, or estate, request the formal accounting directly, in writing, even from people you love and trust completely, because you're entitled to know exactly what was left to you and exactly what's actually happened to it. Comment, the one who asked for the accounting, if you made it to the end with me, and share this with someone who might need to start asking those same questions in their own family. Hit subscribe so you never miss a story, and I'll see you in the next one.